Hello, welcome to Fab Friday. Fab Friday is a part of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, where we present lunch and learn presentations throughout the year. The Fab Friday General Topics Committee includes Barbara Griswold, Bruce Jones, Martha Jones, Sue Kibler, and me. My name is Jane Yokoyama, and I'm happy to host this Fab Friday's presentation entitled Combating Homelessness in Asheville. How did we get here and where are we going? Our guest presenter is Vann Vogel, who is the chair of the board of Homeward. Vann is also a volunteer lawyer for Pisgah Legal Services. He received two 2021 pro bono awards by the Buncombe County Bar Association for his volunteer work on behalf of those seeking unemployment as a result of COVID-19. Vann has been a Pisgah legal volunteer representing clients facing eviction and seeking employment benefits since 2018, and on the Homeward Bound board since 2019. Prior to moving to Asheville in 2016, Vann specialized in labor and employment law in New York City. The views presented are Vann's and not the opinions of either Homeward Bound or Pisgah Legal Services. We are so lucky to have him as a presenter. In this webinar format, your videos and audio will be on mute. Please write any questions you may have in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Vann will try and answer as many questions as possible during and at the end of the presentation. Unless asked to do otherwise, I may give your name as the source of the question. A recording of this webinar will be available at a later date. Finally, at the end of the webinar, I will give you details on future Fab Friday talks and how you can be involved in the program. Now, please welcome Vann Vogel.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and thanks for that very kind introduction, Jane. When Jane asked me if I would consider doing this presentation, she guaranteed me that COVID would be behind us and it would be in person and we could all interact. But I guess that's not going to come to pass. So we are here this morning and I am hitting resume share, but I don't think anybody is seeing the presentation. So all of our good practice is...
No, you are good. We are seeing it. It looks great.
Okay, you are seeing it. Terrific. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about homelessness generally in the first part of our presentation. And then the latter 2/3 will really focus on homelessness in Nashville. That's all. Homelessness has been a concern for a long time. That's why I'm part of Homeward Bound. But I think we all saw an explosion of visible homelessness in the year of COVID, particularly an explosion of the number of unhoused and unsheltered homeless folks in encampments. So we'll look at some reasons for that. We'll look at various approaches that Asheville is taking, coordinated approaches to address homelessness issues. And we'll focus in particular on Housing First. Housing First is the official strategy of both the Housing and Urban Development HUD, City of Asheville, for attacking chronic homelessness. Housing First is exactly what it sounds like. It prioritizes housing without precondition. It posits that housing first lays the groundwork for addressing any number of social issues that make life so difficult for unsheltered individuals or formerly unsheltered individuals. First, a couple of other caveats. We're going to review the numbers. We're going to discuss who is homeless in Asheville, the characteristics of that population. We'll discuss Housing First, and not just its achievements, but some of its arguments in support and where some of its claims are unproven. As we'll go through this presentation, you may ask questions about data, about research, and overall, I'm not an academician. You know, I can barely pronounce the word. The data is not great. It's not great. And the only reason I felt like I could give this presentation is I've spent a lot of time looking at the data. So if you see a report on how good a certain project was or how bad a certain project was, you'll also often see a synopsis of that. And it's difficult to get the data under the synopsis, at least if you're not at a university. But I've tried. So when I present information here, it's based on a lot of effort to get behind the data. So after looking at housing first, we're going to dig into Asheville itself. We're going to focus on Homeward Bound's incredible proposal to do a motel conversion for permanent supportive housing at the Days Inn on Tunnel Road. We'll also discuss the city's proposal to convert the Ramada Inn in East Asheville into a low barrier or emergency shelter. That proposal has seen a great deal of community opposition. We'll discuss what that proposal is all about. A word about words. We're in an era and an environment where we are careful about terminology, and that's for a good reason. But in this presentation and in your questions, which I hope you will provide either through the chat or at the end directly, don't be so concerned about terminology that it inhibits you from asking the question, okay? So the term "the homeless" is now seen as pejorative. It describes, it's a stereotype. And when we hear the words "the homeless," all sorts of things come to mind: mental illness, drug addiction, this, that, which may be true for some parts of the population, but is certainly not true for all parts of the population. Homelessness is not an identity. It's not a choice. It's a condition, and hopefully a temporary one. Generally speaking, the preferred terminology is unhoused. And unhoused includes folks who are in shelter environments, living in cars, in any condition normally seen as unfit for human habitation. It accurately describes a status without attaching a pejorative label to it. As we go through this presentation, the chat box is open. Jane is monitoring. I have no problem. In fact, I really hope folks will ask questions during the presentation because we can't be together, but hopefully we can make it as interactive as possible. Here are a few examples of terminology do's and don'ts. If you look at this presentation afterward, you can focus in on that. I don't want to spend any more time on it. Okay, so when you hear about counts of homelessness, people generally are referring to a housing and urban development required count that is done across the nation. It's called a point in time count, and it's an estimate of homelessness on a given night, usually in January. So volunteers in the community, as well as folks from the city and nonprofits, literally go out in Asheville, and they count the number of unhoused individuals. We'll spend a little bit of time on this slide. It's got a lot of data on it, and sometimes that's tough to navigate, but here's some takeaways from it. So this goes from 2007 to 2020. I guess I could have included 2021, but I couldn't find the slide for that. You'll see that in large measure, the top line is all homeless people. HUD hasn't made the conversion to unhoused. And you'll see that that line's pretty stable since 2007, when Housing First became the desired approach across the country, to the present. You'll see the number of sheltered people, largely stable, some improvement on both of these top lines. But the third line is the scarier line. And here you see the number of unsheltered people reaching a low in 2014, actually 2015, but steadily increasing through 2020. And we saw a large jump in that number in 2021. These are the folks that you see. They're in encampments, they're in doorways. They're not at a men's shelter. So people draw the conclusion that there has been an enormous increase overall in homelessness. Probably not accurate, but there has been a sharp increase in the number of chronically homeless and the folks who are unsheltered. So let's look at Asheville in particular. I believe this photo is probably from under I-240, which was the focus of encampment closures early in the pandemic. So we've got, well, an attempted 3 years here. Sorry for my graphic display is not being great. But you see the number of unsheltered in 2020 at 65 and in 2021 at 116. We know that number of 116 is a vast undercount. When encampments were closed down in Asheville, there were about 170 campers in April of 2020. So why did the camping explode in 2021? Well, because of COVID and the need for social distancing, traditional shelters reduced their capacity. They had to. They couldn't jam people into closed settings. So the number of beds in shelters was reduced. At the same time, the CDC recommended that homeless encampments not be disturbed because of fear of spreading COVID. A very rational determination by the CDC, and a decision embraced not just in Nashville, but I think in communities across the country. Whereas there had been periodic, quote unquote, enforcement efforts to break down encampments, have people get into shelters or quote unquote, move along or move out. During COVID, the enforcement action ceased for a period of time. So why are people homeless? We'll get back to the encampments in a little bit. As an audience, as an OLLI audience, I suspect that the average age of those attending this presentation is probably in the 60s and 70s. Many of us came of age in urban environments. And if you're like me, you saw what didn't seem to be an issue in the 70s start to become an issue in the 80s. And there were a lot of government policy reasons that contributed to that. The deinstitutionalization of mental health patients from hospitals to more local settings and ultimately to the streets began in the 70s. In the 80s, under the Reagan administration, there began a pretty steep decline in support for housing and a reduction of Section 8 vouchers. Section 8 vouchers are the ticket for housing for homeless individuals and low-income individuals. This trend continued in the 90s. We'll remember the Clinton administration's focus on welfare reform, reform of welfare as we know it, a focus on work and personal responsibility. And all of these impacted the amount of homelessness and homelessness recidivism, which was people even once housed falling out of that support and coming back onto the street. As we move into the 21st century, we all are pretty well educated on the harsh impacts of mass arrest for drug-related crimes, mass incarceration, and explosive untreated drug addiction, all of which have contributed to not a sharp rise in homelessness, but in a incredibly difficult job in bringing that number down. We've got some stability, but the ability to bring that number has just not seemed to work. So you take those national trends and then you bring it to Asheville. Generally speaking, sharp increases in homelessness parallel steep increases in the cost of living. Stagnant wages and high rents. Homelessness rises with increase of the population paying more than 1/3 of its income in rent. Income inequality. Wealthy people bid up the cost of housing. And does any of this sound like Asheville? Well, yeah, it all sounds like Asheville. And then you get into really sort of local stuff that contributes to Asheville's inability to really make a dent in homelessness. High numbers of short-term rentals. Coming out of COVID, steep increase in the sale of rental properties as people see that it's time to sort of cash in with high home prices. I'm going to make everybody probably pretty angry at some point in this presentation. So let's get started. Restrictive single-family zoning is, in my view, the highest contributor to homelessness in Asheville and across the country. Density and housing ultimately trickles down to those who can least afford to pay rent. So every time we stop a high-end development, that has a trickle-down effect of limiting housing further down the road. So if we look just in the last year in Asheville, look at these projects that have stalled or disappeared because of some form of community opposition. 319 Biltmore is a project sponsored by the city. It's at the foot of formerly low-income housing on Biltmore Avenue. 319 Biltmore was a former Ford dealership. There was a project to develop hundreds of units of subsidized housing or low-income housing. That is paused because 319 Biltmore is in the neighborhood or in the general vicinity of land impacted by urban development. It itself was not impacted, but it's in the neighborhood. So City Council has put a chill on that. Haywood Street, wonderful organization, proposed and had land to build low-income housing. Their property was indeed property impacted by urban renewal and the devastating impact that project had on the African-American community. Nonetheless, it was a great project, paused because of concern about its location and its history. Charlotte Street, paused, now taken off the market. Montford, projects taken off the market. Woodfin in the development discussion. Talking about the land across the river. Gosh, guys, I know there's steep slopes. I know it would be hard to drive out of it, but that's a lot of housing. And when you diminish the amount of housing, you diminish the amount of housing available for the lowest and highest need income people. Projects in Beaver Dam, more closer to my neighborhood in Asheville, North Asheville. It's all across the board. We all say, no, we don't want that project, but we're all in support of more housing, but it just doesn't happen. So these are all additional pressures in Asheville that contribute to our homelessness situation. So who's homeless in Asheville? Every year, Homeward Bound calculates the number of people who come through its A-Hope Day Center. It's down on North Ann Street. I suspect most everybody on this call is familiar with it. When people come over to North Ann Street, they may well be passing through. It may be for a cup of coffee, maybe for a sandwich. People may come that day, they may come 2 days. But Homeward Bound counts the number of people who come through that center. And that number over the last couple of years has been anywhere from 1,800 to 3,600 people seeking homeless services. On the low end this past year, because A-Hope had very limited hours due to COVID, larger in previous years. Most of the homeless folks in Asheville are single adults. Asheville has a relatively high percentage of veteran folks who are unhoused. This is due to a couple of reasons. One is we have a very good VA, which attracts folks due to the high quality medical services. We also have ABCCM, Asheville Buncombe Christian Ministries. The facility out on Tunnel Road is geared towards veterans. It is a temporary shelter, but when folks graduate from that temporary shelter, they're still in the community. So those are a couple of reasons why the numbers of veterans are so high in Asheville. That's not true nationally. Most of our focus at Homeward Bound and focus in the city is on individuals. Typically, they're male. Most are white, but African Americans are way overrepresented in the homeless population in Nashville. It's about 30% people of color, whereas the population is 11 to 15%. About 175 of Asheville's folks counted in the the count that's done in January are considered chronically homeless. And the chronically homeless is a HUD definition, and it relates to people who have, in addition to their homelessness, have one or more disabilities. The disability may be a physical disability, a mental illness, and it includes addiction and sobriety. And it's folks who essentially have been on the streets for a year, perhaps 3 times, 4 times within the course of a year. And this group is really the group most at risk, but literally for dying on the street. It's Homeward Bound's focus, and it's largely the City of Asheville's focus. All right, before we go to programs in Asheville that address all aspects of homelessness, from prevention to housing, might be a good time to stop and see if there are any questions.
This is a great time to answer a couple questions. There are 2. One is from Darshan, and her question is, what is the data before 2007 as to the number of homeless? Was there a spike before the 2007, 2008 real estate crash? And I'll let you answer that one, and then I'll give you another question after that.
Okay, it's a really good question, Darshan. And I went back to 2007 on the chart because that's essentially the time that Housing First became a focus not only of HUD, but also of the City of Asheville. I did discuss the rise of homelessness dating back to the 80s and through early 07, 08. Clearly, the housing crisis in 07 probably increased those numbers. And if we look back to 05, 06, when the economy was booming, I suspect those numbers were lower. I don't have that data for you.
Okay, great. The other question comes from Diane. She asks that she mentions she's new to the area, but could you please explain the reasons that the developments that you mentioned were halted? She's not sure if she understands the issue with urban renewal and the reason for why these were stopped.
Okay, well, that's, if you're new to the area, that question encompasses a whole lot. Just briefly, in the 70s, Asheville, like numerous communities across the country, cut swaths through African-American communities to build roads. I mean, that's the simplest answer. So if you go out on 240 and imagine this road cuts through communities of color that may not have been seemed prosperous at the time, and they may have had a lot of dilapidated housing, but they were communities with businesses, families, churches, folks who were displaced by those developments. And, as I understand it, and I'm not the expert here, the size of the African-American community since the 70s has been gradually, maybe not so gradually, diminishing in size and in stability. So Asheville has, at a city council level, adopted proposals for reparations. In so doing, there's been a concentration on the communities most impacted by that urban development. So if you see a housing project in those communities, it feeds into the reparations discussion. Hopefully a couple of the projects I mentioned aren't terminated, but are only paused for more consideration. But unfortunately, as you look across the community, paused projects become terminated projects. So that's on the one side. On the other side, you've got other development opponents. There have been proposals for large housing projects in the community, which have been opposed for good reasons, but they don't go forward and housing doesn't get built. So I would encourage you to go online and research some of these projects. I'm sure I left out others, and I'm sure people on this call might want to jump in and say, well, of course they were suspended. Of course it was the right decision, et cetera. We can debate those issues, but the bottom line for housing is not getting built. And the primary problem, in my view, is single family housing zoning over much of the city.
Okay, those are all the questions I see in the queue. Oh, wait, here's one more. Let's see. All right, there it says 175 chronically homeless sounds low. Out of the 1,800 to 3,600 indeed, is this the only percentage that are indicative or have SMI?
SMI, I'm not familiar with what that term means.
Maybe that.
But anyway, let me address the question. The larger number is folks who have come through the A Hope Day Center. As I said, it could be for a cup of coffee and a sandwich, could be for a couple of days. Homeward Bound is the primary agency in Asheville that conducts what's called coordinated entry. So as someone in the community is here, generally for more than a day, generally it's got to be as much as a couple of weeks coming through Homeward Bound. It's clear that they're not here for a day or two, just traveling through, but they are in the community. They are without shelter. They need a housing plan. At about that 2-week point, Homeward Bound will begin the data entry interviews of the individuals to determine their needs and to start to come up with a housing plan for them. So most of those folks don't get to that coordinated entry point. You know, they're in and out for a few days. So after a couple of weeks, you get to that coordinated entry, you get to those larger numbers in the 500s. And out of that population, you have a smaller chronically homeless population, which, you know, didn't get kicked out by their parents, didn't get kicked out by their girlfriend. They've been unhoused for generally more than a year. And they also have a significant disability or sobriety issue.
Great.
So I hope that addresses that.
Right, and SMI stands for severe mental illness. So
Okay, yeah, in fact, I've got a slide and a couple of slides that uses SMI, so my bad for not picking up on that.
here's another question, and it's like, do we know, from Carol, do we know if the panhandlers are homeless or just passing through?
I'm sure it's both, but we don't. I mean, there are privacy issues. Nobody, to my knowledge, has tried to identify a group of people as quote unquote panhandlers. I shouldn't say quote unquote, they are panhandlers, and tried to dig into that small subset to say, okay, where are they from and how long have they been here? So I'm sure it's a combination of both.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Well, we can go on and I'll ask you any other questions after this point. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I've talked about Homeward Bound and I'm associated with Homeward Bound, but there are a lot of great organizations in Asheville, which together provide what's known as a continuum of care to address homelessness prevention and homelessness. So let's start about prevention, right? Ounce of prevention being worth a pound of cure. It's certainly true with respect to the unsheltered community. So 3 agencies very much involved in prevention: Physical Legal, Evelyn Charities, the Haywood Street Mission. And forgive me if I leave out an agency that somebody on the call works with. I don't mean to. These are just by example. So Physical Legal represents in a pilot program that's now been running for 3 or 4 years. Before COVID, Pisco had a table outside eviction court. And if you came into court with your eviction notice without a lawyer because you can't afford one, didn't know you needed one, didn't understand what was going on, Physical Legal had a table outside to say, hey, what's going on? Do you want me to review this? Do you want representation? That was my entry into this world in Asheville back in 2018. I was one of those lawyers who sat out there. And Pisgah, in turn, works with Evelyn, Homeward Bound, United Way. Surely I should have had United Way on this slide, to then find resources. You negotiate with the landlord, you buy more time, you find a way to pay the rent. And that's what these agencies have done historically. Evelyn has always been terrific. If you needed $500 for a utility bill or 3 months of back utility bills, Evelyn was a great place to go. Haywood Street, same thing, in addition to food and clothing, access to some emergency funds. That's historic. Right now, there are tens of thousands of emergency funds available to prevent homelessness. It's just taken a little time to get these funds out to the community. We can talk a little bit about that later. Second category is diversion and rapid rehousing. So we talked about the person who comes into AHOPE and they say, well, I don't have a place to sleep tonight. And they've been coming in a few days and you talk with them and you explore what resources do they have? Do they have a brother and Candler or Canton? Is the relationship with their parents irretrievably severed, or can a reach out be made to find a place to sleep? So you don't want folks in the homelessness system. You want to find alternatives to that. A lot of those alternatives are short-term, but a lot of times they work. The reason that number of 18 to 3,600 doesn't become that number of homeless people is because diversion works. Rapid rehousing, which is a program that has traditionally focused on the veterans community, but also includes non-veterans. It works because you can find funding to pay those utility bills, maybe to pay rent for 3 to 6 months. People get back on their feet and they don't become homeless on the street. Day services. We've talked about AHOPE, Haywood Street, Beloved, countless faith communities. Think about all the food banks, Manna. Think about the meals that are provided in Pritchard Park or at ABCCM, provided by churches. Folks on the street know where those meals are. They go to them and it supports their survival. Doesn't necessarily get them housing, but they survive. And that's incredibly important. Okay, so then we move into shelter. Before COVID, we've thought of emergency shelter in terms of rescue ministries, the Salvation Army, RIDI, Room at the Inn, which was a very important program for Homeward Bound. They provided shelter for up to a dozen women on any given night, 365 days a year. Code Purple shelters, shelters opened on really cold nights by ABCCM and others. These shelters are designed for short-term stays. Maybe it's overnight, maybe it's 30 days, maybe 60, maybe 90, generally not more than 90. God bless everybody who provides them, but they come with a lot of rules and a lot of baggage. Many who are unsheltered don't regard emergency shelters as safe. They've had their property stolen. There's been violence, there are knives, there are drugs. Emergency shelters typically don't accommodate a spouse. They're designed for single individuals. They almost certainly don't accommodate a pet, which may be key to dealing with everything you're dealing with. There may be restrictions such as, okay, you need to see ID, need to see a social security number. Well, what if you do have a criminal history? In particularly, what if you have a sex offender status? Typically, emergency shelters aren't geared to accommodate those particularly difficult scenarios. So going into COVID, we found some things that worked pretty well. At the beginning of COVID, Homeward Bound, working with the City of Asheville, opened a congregate shelter in the Civic Center. But due to COVID, we wanted to not have folks in close proximity, but we wanted a non-congregate option. So with FEMA money, great support from the city, Homeward Bound operated a non-congregate shelter at the Red Roof Inn in West Asheville. That program was remarkably successful. There were very few problems in terms of community opposition. The faith community supported it with meals. A number of folks who went into that shelter operation came out with housing. But the FEMA money ran out June 30th, and the Red Roof Inn closed at that point. At the same time, the city had determined that the encampments that were across the community were not safe. There was reports of drug use, reports of violence, drug dealing, et cetera. So at about the same time, those encampments were closed. So the city needed to find some alternative to putting 170 folks or more out on the street. And the city entered into a contract with the Ramada Inn in East Asheville to take on a large number of folks, both from the Red Roof Inn, if they hadn't found housing, but mainly from the encampments. The city is now proposing that the Ramada Inn be purchased by the city and that it be operated as a low barrier shelter or an emergency shelter. And I draw that distinction because it's unclear at the end of the day how low barrier the Ramada Inn will be. So let's just review what low barrier means. If you want a bed at ABCCM on Tunnel Road, it's a marvelous operation. They run a temporary shelter at Veterans Restoration Quarters, 4 beds to a motel room, sort of bunk quarters. You need to be sober or committed to sobriety. A low barrier shelter does not have that requirement. And at this point, the Ramada Inn is proposed as a low barrier shelter. We'll talk a little bit about the Ramada Inn in a few moments. And there are also new proposals for high barrier transitional housing. Think about the ABCCM's Veteran Restoration Quarters, but their new project, which is terrifically exciting, is Restoration Village. It's down by the Asheville outlets, much larger. They're in a capital campaign for that. But again, it's not going to serve the same population that a Homeward Bound serves because there are significant barriers to participating in those programs. Okay, so Homeward Bound focuses on housing first, and particularly permanent supportive housing. Housing first, as we've mentioned, is exactly what it sounds like. It posits that housing is the key to addressing other issues that contribute to your unsheltered status. Housing first, statistically, is the most effective solution to providing housing stability. Its only requirement essentially is that you follow the lease. You know, you can't be disruptive to other people, but if you can live without causing harm to others, you're probably going to be able to succeed in a housing first environment. Now, what Homeward Bound does so effectively is it combines the housing first lease, and that could be at City of Asheville Housing Authority, it could be with a private landlord. We'll talk about Homeward Bound's managed properties as well. But not only do you have the ability to find a place, but you have the support that makes that successful. Case management helps address issues that might lead you back to homelessness. It helps you go down to file for SSDI. It helps you get to a medical appointment. Case managers work daily with their assigned population, from anywhere from 10 to 20 people, to make that housing work. So let's talk about housing first. How did we get here, and what to look like going forward? In the 1990s, the first empirical studies began to demonstrate the success of supportive housing with chronically homeless population. Catch up my slides here. In 2000, the National Alliance to End Homelessness launched a campaign to end chronic homelessness through a housing first approach. President Bush was wholeheartedly in favor of housing first as part of his fiscal year 2003 budget. He set a goal of ending chronic homelessness in the next decade as a top objective, and encouraged state and local governments to adopt 10-year plans to end homelessness. City of Asheville did exactly that. In 2006, it adopted its plan to end chronic homelessness in 10 years. And since 2006 to the present, Housing First programs share of HUD funding. Every year, each geography gets a chunk of money from HUD. And it can be used for permanent housing, or it can be used for temporary housing, or it can be used for housing services. It can be used for emergency grants, to pay that utility bill, to pay the back rent. It can be used for all those reasons. But the percentage directed to housing first has moved from the 50th percentile to more than 70%. So housing first is our federal philosophy, at least it was until the Trump administration. We'll talk about that in a minute. And it's our local philosophy. So in 2006, this is the City of Asheville's plan to end homelessness. Its goal was to end chronic homelessness and reduce all types of homelessness over the next decade by investing resources in a coordinated, sustained effort that addresses the underlying causes of homelessness. It's a lofty goal. Chronic homelessness did decline, as we saw from that earlier slide, in Asheville during the next several years, but it has stabilized and again begun to increase. As part of this project, Homeward Bound creates a by name list of chronically homeless. So we looked at that number of 175. That's not a general number. We know who those folks are. We know they're chronically homeless. We're working with them to have a housing plan. But as I looked at this goal, I realized that there's a contradiction in it. And the contradiction is ending chronic homelessness. You can do that through housing. a lot of housing. But in addressing the underlying causes of homelessness, that's really a different approach, isn't it? You know, do you concentrate your efforts on rents, on sobriety, on domestic violence, on mental health? All of that stuff is important, but money invested there is really not increasing the housing supply. So this goal encompasses it all. And maybe the goal is too broad. And maybe that's why we haven't made a whole lot of progress. Food for thought. Don't have an answer to it. They're both important. What we have found at Homeward Bound and in studies across the country is the housing philosophy, housing first philosophy, works in providing stable housing for individuals. So this individual in the photo, you can't see what he has, but he's got a plaque that identifies that he's in stable housing. So since 2006, Homeward Bound has worked with over 2,000 people and helped them find housing. Our statistics indicate that 89% of those remain housed. And as we speak today, Homeward Bound works with over 300 tenants across Asheville, both in who are living with private landlords, who are in housing authority apartments, and also in apartments managed by Homeward Bound. So our results aren't an anomaly. More Place in Charlotte is a project that started around 2014. It was built from scratch. It houses 85 chronically homeless folks at its inception. And at least its initial rates, and I should be able to update this slide, but their retention rates, their housing stability rate is in the 81% range. UNC Charlotte did a follow-up study. I think it's largely based on More Place, so it does update that numbers to an 80% success rate. Other national studies show housing stability using the Housing First model in the 70 to 80% success rate, while transitional housing, think of the ABCCM model, generally has results in the 50% rate. Okay, so looks good, right? And it is good. It's really good. It's great. But you got to ask, well, what does that mean? Well, what does housing stability mean? And what does the data show? The data is not, there's just not enough research in these areas. But when we look at housing stability, we're typically looking 1 to 2 years out. So if you're doing a controlled group study, you're comparing the control group that is housed essentially without precondition and provided support against another group that has either no housing intervention or perhaps the housing intervention is more of a shelter environment. And comparing those two groups, there's no doubt that with Housing First and with support, stability is greatly increased. But what does it mean to be stable? Well, the data is not great. So if Homeward Bound houses someone and they move and we lose track of them, for these purposes, we consider that person to be still housed. If they die, for these purposes, they're not unhoused, they're still housed. If they go to prison, they are housed. So basically, Homeward Bound, and I think other institutions that do these studies, unless there's evidence that you were back on the street, you were considered to be still stably housed. We know that's not 100% accurate, but it's the best numbers we got. It doesn't undercut the notion that Housing First works, but it is something that should be understood when you look at these incredibly high statistics. Okay, but housing stability is not the only rationale for Housing First. Proponents of Housing First also argue that Housing First saves money. So let's look at these pretty shocking numbers. An ER visit on average costs someone, generally taxpayers, $1,200 for a visit. A night in jail costs taxpayers $166. One day in the hospital, $2,000. All right, we can put somebody in a permanent supportive apartment for $39 a night. All right, if they're housed, they're not in the hospital and they're not in jail, and we're reducing the number of emergency room visits, we're saving a heck of a lot of money through Housing First. Temporary shelters tend to be far more expensive. What about the individuals in permanent supportive housing? Well, the data is mixed, but it tends to indicate that the quality of life for somebody housed with support is better than if they're camping on French Broad. Makes sense. So we'll look at some numbers. Housed participants score better on standardized mental illness tests than do unhoused participants. Self-assessments show they feel better. The perception of their own mental illness is better. Housing First doesn't require abstinence or sobriety, but nonetheless, after housing, the percent of participants that used any drug fall. The number of days between last drug use fall. They may not be eliminated, but they fall. The number of days without intoxication increase by, say, 3 days. Doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're constantly inebriated and intoxication, 3 days is a pretty darn good start. The average number of emergency room visits falls. One study said that ED visits fall about 60%. And after a year, housed participants had two fewer visits to the emergency room than unhoused participants. So if we go back to that slide, 2 fewer visits, did you save $2,500? Well, yeah, there's an argument that society saved $2,500 by virtue of that housing placement. All right, so looking at some larger studies, University of California at San Francisco did a large controlled group study, found that 86% of the folks in the intervention group remained housed during the study period. However, their study did not demonstrate fewer emergency room visits or fewer interactions with law enforcement. So there's mixed data out there. But what we can conclude, I think, from all the studies is Housing First is the best solution to provide housing stability for those really suffering and in danger of dying on the street. And while the economic arguments for Housing First, we'll talk about that in a second, may not have the same volume of support in the data, from my perspective, Housing First is the humane approach. So if you combine humanity with stability, even if you can't make an overwhelming economic argument for Housing First, it's still the one I prefer, and that's why I'm involved in Homeward Bound. All right, so let's look at some of the criticisms of not Homeward Bound, but of Housing First. So SMI, I now know what it means. I forgot about this slide. This slide shows that a large number of PSH units have been created since 2010, but the number of folks with serious mental illness, the needle hasn't budged very much. So why does permanent supportive housing not pay for itself? What do the critics say? Well, it's cheaper than emergency transitional housing. But emergency transitional housing is temporary. You want people in and out. Maybe it's 1 day, maybe it's a week, maybe it's 90 days. But when you talk about permanent supportive housing, you're talking about potentially a lifetime of support. So while there are cost savings with PSH, there aren't necessarily cost reductions because you're talking about a lifetime as opposed to short transitions. And when you look at data on emergency room visits, police department interaction, when people come into permanent supportive housing, they typically are in a acute situation. So the need, or not the need, but the unfortunate reality of mental health visits, emergency room visits, interaction with law enforcement, is going to be pretty high when they enter the system. Hopefully, with PSH, those numbers really go down over the course of time. I apologize. Let's see if I can mute that. So the gains you might get in those first couple of years may not be sustained over a lifetime. Another criticism of Housing First is that it's lost its original focus. So going back to the Bush administration, the focus initially was towards permanent supportive housing for the chronically homeless, and there was also a big focus on the veterans population. Housing First, as we see in our discussions in Nashville regarding the Ramada Inn, has evolved into what might be called a whole system orientation, such that low barrier or no barrier should be a precondition to support for AHOPE, for the rescue mission, for ABCCM, for the Ramada Inn. It's gravitated towards, as we say, a whole system orientation that has now been discussed in Asheville in terms of what are the requirements to move into a emergency shelter such as the Ramada Inn. So if you read Nextdoor, if you read Asheville Politics, if you look at all the criticism of the Ramada Inn, you'll see a lot of discussion on this topic of who should be allowed these services, what preconditions should be set. The City of Asheville's position at this point is this is going to be a low or no barrier shelter. And that means that we will take folks in who have serious drug addiction issues, that have serious alcohol issues, that may have a criminal record, that may be sex offenders. But we are going to take those folks in, we're going to provide services, and using the model that was successful during COVID at the Red Roof Inn, we, Asheville, whoever operates the Ramada Inn, will work with service providers, work with landlords, and we will provide and transition folks into more permanent supportive housing. So that's the goal for the Ramada Inn. All right, so the Trump administration, not surprisingly, took a different perspective on permanent supportive housing than did previous administrations. They brought in a guy by the name of, Robert Marbutt to run the Bush administration housing programs. Marbutt came to the administration from his work as a consultant for several cities. Marbutt's approach was essentially out of sight, out of mind. His consulting work did not focus on resolving homelessness. I would say it focused on hiding homelessness. His strategy involved moving homeless folks from city centers out to remote locations, less visible to the community, sort of larger locations, and focused on what he called housing independence. The focus was not on housing first, it was on housing readiness. He argued that housing first is not a good option for those hoping to live in an environment, for example, where drugs and alcohol aren't tolerated. Let's look at the Ramada Inn. City of Asheville may say, well, no barriers to housing. We'll have addicts here. But let's say you're in a situation where being exposed to addiction is not in your best interest. Maybe the Ramada Inn is not the best place for you. So the term housing fourth developed in the Trump administration, and it's essentially meant, okay, you want to do something different with your life, you're willing to make certain commitments and get to certain status. Shelter's job is to make you housing ready. And once housing ready, then we can focus on permanent placement. So that housing first versus housing readiness is essentially at the core of the debate we have in Asheville and still at the core of the debate nationally. I happen to believe that housing first is the right approach. And that's why Homeward Bound is proud to present its Home is Key project. Home is Key is Homeward Bound's project to convert the Days Inn on Tunnel Road into 85 units of permanent supportive housing. We have acquired the Days Inn with the generous support of Dogwood Trust, the City of Asheville, and Buncombe County. One inspiration for the Days Inn was a very similar project in Santa Rosa, California. If you think this looks like a Days Inn, it does. Santa Rosa converted a Days Inn to permanent housing. Our project is going to look a whole lot like this, except we won't have any palm trees. But it's going to be a very similar project. Before I get to discussion of Home is Key and the Days Inn, why don't we take another break for questions?
Okay. Great. I do have a few questions and comments. The first one is from Tom, who says, how do we strike a balance between compassionate support for fellow human beings and preventing outreach to homeless from becoming a magnet, attracting numbers that become a greater burden to the community?
Great question, Tom, and a question that I think all of us who think about this issue struggle with. So first, in my general complaint about not enough data in this whole world, I've not seen any data that would demonstrate that Asheville is a magnet for a transient homeless population because of the types of services it offers, whether it's A-Hope and ABCCM and Haywood Street today, or whether it's projects like the Ramada Inn and the Days Inn in the future. I've looked at the numbers of homelessness in Asheville, and when people measure it, they typically look at the homeless population per 100,000. Asheville is high. Let's see. Our number, which includes all of Buncombe County, is about 209 per 100,000. That places us in the top 23% of HUD subdivisions, not the highest. Interestingly, Columbia, South Carolina, and Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, have higher numbers per 100,000. So I would imagine, although I don't know for sure, I haven't studied it, that Myrtle Beach and Columbia don't have the levels of support for the homeless community that Asheville has, but it has slightly better weather. So weather may be a larger determinant than social services. Homeward Bound has asked the question of folks on its chronically homeless list, what's your last address before you became homeless? And I think 80 to 90% list a local address, which suggests that they've been in the community for a while. They didn't just show up yesterday. But that question doesn't go back 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So I don't know if our services attract more folks. Intuitively, I would say, yeah, it probably does. But what we do know when we focus on the chronically homeless is it's not the person who decided, hey, I want to camp out for the summer. It's folks that have documented illnesses of severity, have documented substance abuse issues, and have been homeless for a long time. So I think that addresses some people's concern of, well, this is the guy who just wanted to camp out in cool Asheville for a while.
Okay, the next one is a comment from Diane, who she does remember she's a social worker when institutionalization happened and of psychiatric hospitals, mostly to community-based supportive housing, but it really didn't do the second part because,
Right.
So that's, I mean, I agree, that's part of the issue. There's one more question, but before I get to that, I just want to apologize to Martha. Her name is Martha Marshall, not Martha Jones. She's part of the Fab Friday committee. So I just wanted to let everyone know that. Another person who's anonymous wants to know, how does this housing work with the newly immigrant population that is housed at the Ramada Inn? And is there any way they can help?
I'm not familiar with any focus of the Ramada Inn on immigrant population or undocumented population. So that may be something that's new. So I can't address that question.
Okay.
And frankly, I can't address the question of whether there's any requirement for documented status to move into housing that Homeward Bound supports. I do not believe there is, but I don't know that for sure.
Okay. There are a couple more questions that have come in. Jill asked, East Asheville will have more burden to house the homeless with restoration quarters and days in, and now the Ramada Inn. That's a lot of facility. And what are your feelings about that?
It is a lot. It is a lot. It's in terms of the days in, and I guess this is true of the Ramada Inn as well. There's very good transportation and very good access to downtown social services. So from a housing first approach of what is in the best interests of the folks that we're providing either shelter or permanent supportive housing, these locations are ideal in that they were available, somewhat affordable. Literally, there's a bus stop across from the Days Inn, but it does lead to folks saying, "Hey, why my neighborhood?" I understand that. What I believe about the Days Inn is that we have such experience at Homeward Bound in managing and working with the folks who will not be homeless when they're here, but they will be housed. That the Days Inn will not be a significant contributor to the questioner's perception of increased burden on East Asheville. I think Ramada Inn already is. It's going to be important to get a very qualified operator for that facility. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the number of emergency vehicles coming to the Days Inn is not going to be noticeable. I'm not going to tell you that increased activity, police activity, is not going to be noticeable. I think it is, but if you look at Asheville, Buncombe County as a whole, the goal of these projects is stabilization and ultimately to reduce those numbers.
Great. Okay, a couple more comments or questions. First is 2 thumbs up from John for Home is Key and Homeward Bound. Someone else mentioned that they don't think that the refugees have come in yet. And then one more comment is, it seems rare that existing residents support additional multifamily housing. Is there any way to realign incentives and to assuage their concerns? So I don't know if I should have.
Yeah, no, we've only got a few more minutes left, and I'm not going to tackle the last one, which is it's hard. You know, you can go on YouTube and kind of research the city of Minneapolis and what it has done to do away with single family zoning and its success in increasing the availability of low affordable housing. And we talk about affordable housing, you know, the homeless population is just a small percentage of the folks who suffer from lack of affordable housing in Nashville. I mean, it's awful for everyone. We need more housing, and you know, my personal view is the character of Montford can be preserved if you still have some more apartments. You know, I lived in New York City for a number of years, and you have great neighborhoods with wonderful old historic housing right next to apartment buildings, and you know it manages to work. But let me go forward with a little bit more on Home is Key and what that's all about, a little bit more about the Ramada Inn, and then we'll take a couple more questions at the end. Okay, so as I say, Days Inn, they're all kind of alike. This is a little bit glorified depiction of what it will look like. We're not going to have this level of greenery out in front of Tunnel Road, but the Days Inn is a remarkable facility for what we want to do. It's large. It's 3 buildings. This main building has lots of common space for MAHEC to come in, for Physical Legal Services to come in, for Grace Covenant Presbyterian Church to come in and serve a meal. It's got a huge kitchen. It's got a huge laundry. We're going to have computer rooms and you know, other types of meet and greet rooms where community groups can come in and provide those types of supportive services. It's just a wonderful facility. Now back here, there's a big, you can't see it, but there's a pool. Okay, the pool's going to go away, but it's going to be great green space for the residents. So it's just a superb facility. Here's where we are with it. We have purchased it with the city, county, and Dogwood Trust support. That was a $6.4 million acquisition. We're in the throes of a capital campaign that will cost about $7 million. That's a little bit high, but keep in mind that we will be renovating those rooms to provide kitchen facilities, you know, where they don't exist. The goal is to, by the end of 2022, be able to move upward to 85 chronically homeless individuals into that facility with permanent supportive housing. Some of those are going to move from the Woodfin apartments, which Homeward Bound does not operate but manages. And what this facility does, together with the Woodfin and with another apartment complex that Homeward Bound bought called on Short Michigan Avenue last year, is it provides a number of different options for folks who might not be able to live with a private landlord successfully, may not work out at the housing authority. So Homeward Bound will now have 3 other additional options to find a situation that works for individuals. As mentioned, large community spaces, space for service providers, and certainly not the least, office space for Homeward Bound. I will not tell you the Days Inn is going to be a perfect project and will not have challenges. Bringing 85 of the most acute chronically homeless together in a facility with exterior rooms, balconies, go back to the Days Inn. You know, this is largely be the same at the Home is Key project. These outdoor balconies, outdoor spaces are not conducive to great interaction with folks who have been on the street, who don't have a lot of experience in more community settings. It's largely untested. The Days Inn conversion in Santa Rosa has worked, but only about 50% of those residents were chronically homeless. The rest, about 60%, were veterans. Now, veterans that may have equally acute issues, but they're different issues. And the population mix has worked in Santa Rosa. We will see how well it works at the day's end. We're optimistic because of the quality of our support, but it's largely unproven in this type of setting. Local businesses will object to the increased visibility of low-income residents. We've received a lawyer's letter. The Ramada Inn has received lawyer's letters. The Sunrise, which is operating the Ramada Inn, has received lawyer's letters. Nothing that really raises a legal issue that would stop these developments from going forward. But it's kind of along the lines of, hey guys, we're watching you, and if anything happens, we're going to hold you accountable. We're not real concerned so far with the legal threat. Police and emergency activity in the short term is likely to increase. We hope that's a short-term issue, and as people come into the day's end, become more comfortable, get the support they need, that activity will decrease. So my conclusions, and we'll then open it back up to questions. I think housing first is the gold standard of residential stability. It gives the acute, chronically homeless the best chance to address the disabling conditions and live a better life. Housing first is the humane response to the situation we encounter. It may or may not be the best economic response. I think there are definitely economic benefits, but I will not argue that it pays for itself. Housing first will not end homelessness, but with enough support, it does have the possibility of ending chronic homelessness. And with the Days End project, you know, we're going to cut chronic homelessness in Nashville 60%. We'll come back in 2 years and see if I'm right. That's the end of my presentation. And if there are other questions, be happy to answer them and, you know, continue the discussion if that's possible, Jane, beyond the hour, if that's if anyone is interested.
Vann, there are right now 2 more questions in the Q&A that we can answer, and then maybe I can list my email, I suppose, and people can forward questions after that, which I can forward to you since I know you. But the first one is from Martha, who wants you to talk about the difficulty of homeless people being able to get a job, or if you want to speak about that.
I mentioned Room at the Inn, which was a project that started at Homeward Bound a number of years ago, working with various faith communities. So the project was geared towards women with some stability. Each faith community, or many faith communities, would provide shelter for 1 to 2 weeks at a time, provide meals. At the same time, folks in the Room at the Inn were working with Homeward Bound's day center on North Ann Street. At the day center, folks can have an address. They can get mail, they can get prescription drugs, they can get disability checks mailed there. And when you have even that level of support for folks who are living on the street, it enables things that are impossible, like getting a job, to be possible. So I remember one of the ladies at Room at the Inn telling me, I got a job because AHOPE allowed me to have an address. You know, I couldn't fill out a job application without an address. AHOPE gave me an address and I got a job. So those types of services make it possible for people that really would have no chance to enter the workforce. Now, when we look at the chronically homeless, those are the folks most at risk of dying on the street. There are folks without much stability in their lives. It is a challenge to provide stable housing. That's the first goal of Homeward Bound. Those support services that will take the most stable and allow them to transition, to find work, those will be successful for a minority of that population. it will not be successful for the majority of that population. So the Homeward Bound programs, it's not a job program, it's a housing stability program, the right program for that. And it's a compassionate program. And yes, some people, hopefully more than just a few, will be aided in transitioning to employment. And people do graduate from Homeward Bound, don't get me wrong. People move on with their lives out of supportive housing. But for this population of 175, looking at the 85 at the days in, the initial focus will be on housing stability.
Okay, great. And this last question is, how is the police department involved with Homeless Bound to identify problems initially with unhoused individuals? The police department has lost many officers, and how will it handle available problems in the community when the police are not available?
Homeward Bound has had a terrific relationship with APD that hit a hiccup in the midst of COVID. So Homeward Bound, as I mentioned, operates 18 Housing Authority of Asheville units at the Woodfin, which is on Woodfin Street downtown. And without being too Pollyannish about it, there's been an element of Andy Griffith in terms of our relationship with the APD. If one of our Woodfin residents was inebriated on the street, they wouldn't be thrown in jail. The APD would pick someone up. They'd say, "Oh, I know, they live at the Woodfin." They'd bring them over, drop them off, go up to their room. Not an issue. No jail costs, no police interaction, no bringing up before a judge. And that really, I think, summarized the relationship. Very good relationship. During COVID, as the number of police officers decreased in Nashville and as tensions rose around the camping issue, there was some difficulty where APD thought that Homeward Bound was not being as cooperative as it needed to be with APD. I think we've patched that issue up. We now own the Days Inn on Tunnel Road. We monitor, we have a fence around it. We haven't started construction. It's at risk for folks trespassing, climbing over the fence, trying to move into a room. We're working very closely with APD on providing security, and APD is responsive to any reports that we've had. Similarly, over at A Hope on North Ann Street, as long as Homeward Bound is willing to prosecute for trespassing, APD will be responsive. If an agency says, well, we're not going to prosecute, we're not going to do anything other than call you, then given its resources, I think it's very understandable that APD would say, hey, don't call me about trespassing if you're not willing to do anything about it. So there have been some hiccups, but I think the relationship now is back on track. Jane, I can't hear you now.
Sorry, there's one last question. And then after this, I think I'll put in the Q&A, I think that's the right place, my email, if anybody has any questions as well. So the question is, how and when are the unsheltered evaluated or assessed to determine if they have a disability that qualifies them for PSH? What assessment tool is used and who does it? Is this assessment process reflected in the chronically homeless data to be sure that some who are chronic are not being overlooked?
I didn't hear the last part, Jane.
Oh, okay. It says, what assessment tool is used and who does it? And is this assessment process reflected in the chronically homeless data to make sure some who are chronic are not being overlooked?
Yeah. I think the assessment process is working well, maybe not perfectly. So I'm not going to use the acronyms, but there is a common assessment process that's used across the country. In Asheville, Homeward Bound is the primary agency conducting those assessments. So remember, I mentioned that if you showed up at A Hope for a cup of coffee or to get out of the rain, you're not going to go through that assessment process. But after if you've been around for a couple of weeks and you're coming in every day or, periodically during those couple of weeks, then consideration for that assessment process will start. It's very data driven. Homeward Bound is not the only agency doing it. And there is interest in shifting that responsibility from the nonprofits to the city of Asheville. So there's a single place doing it. I think the numbers are reflective with this caveat. Far fewer assessments were done during COVID than the year before. So we may have some catching up to do. We probably do have some catching up to do. AHOPE's hours it was a miracle that we were able to keep it operating throughout COVID, but the hours were severely curtailed. So we do have a backlog in doing those assessments. That said, I don't think the numbers I've shared are going to be terribly far off. And by the way, people don't get on this list and stay there. They move in and out. They leave the community. They find housing. It's not a static list.
Vann, I have learned so much from your presentation, and I did put my email address in the Q&A for people who have any additional questions. I think in the OLLI Observer, there is something going on, also a forum for the homelessness. So if anyone else wants to look at that area, check your OLLI Observer. But your honesty on this thing and the amount of work you put into this that I know you have done since I know you has been incredible. So thank you so much. So I really want to thank Vann for his presentation, and it is time to end it. So I want to just remind people that there are other Fridays coming up. The next one, we alternate with health issues. So the next one is on Talk Saves Lives with Marshall Hammer Association for Suicide Prevention. That'll be next Friday, October 15th. And following that, we go back to the general topics, which will be on October 22nd. It's Robert Beanblossom, who will talk about the cradle of forestry in America. And again, OLLI Observer is a great place to find all these links and this information. If you're interested in being a Fab Friday presenter, or you have a topic you'd like to hear, such as the one Vann presented on, he did a great job. Please contact any of the Fab Friday committee members, Jane Yokoyama, that's me, Barbara Griswold, Martha Marshall, Bruce Jones, or Sue Kibler. For health-related topics, you can contact Jenny Felice. And I want to thank everyone who attended this Fab Friday. I know it was informative, and everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Anytime.